We have a terrific panel who have put some real effort into coming up with some sharp and provocative presentations. So I want to ensure we have enough time to hear from everybody and also enough time to actually have some proper discussion and debate. So we'll get started, and I've been told we'll run until about 5:30. I'm Eric Beinhocker, and I'm happy to say that between the printing of the program and now, my job has changed. So it says in the program I was working for McKinsey. I'm now very happy to say I'm working at Oxford University, and this is my first chance to present under that hat as part of a new INET-funded center there. And then my collaborator, Doan Farmer, is sitting here, is also going to be a part of that. As far as I know, we don't have anyone else here who's changed jobs since the printing of the. Carlos.
I say so myself, but if you want, you can say it too.
Well, I'll let you do that, Carlo. But I want to just briefly introduce our excellent panel here. And actually, I'll start off with you, Carlo, who has I won't give the long biography since they are in the program, but who has a distinguished career at the Potsdam Institute. But maybe you might want to just say a word about your new...
Well, as you may see, I'm old and close to death, so I'm now retired since 2 weeks, unfortunately. I know that this makes going to movies cheaper, but going to conference is more expensive. That said, I'm running an association called the Global Climate Forum, and I'm very happy and proud to be in the house of the Beinhocker Foundation at Berlin, which is the hub of real new thinking here in Berlin. Okay.
Well, the key thing is in Berlin there is a house, which is the Mercator House, also known as the Projektzentrum Berlin, which is the hub of new thinking in general, and in particular with regard to things like sustainable development and climate policy. And the Global Climate Forum sits on the top floor. We have a roof terrace, we have a coffee machine. You're all welcome to pass by. And my new job is to enjoy being there and enjoy seeing all the wonderful people who are working there and trying patiently to make some progress on new thinking.
Excellent. We can all aspire to Carlo's notion of retirement. Since, as far as I know, the rest of you haven't changed jobs, I'm just going to briefly run down and introduce Seth Klein, who's director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. We have Gernot Wagner, who is an economist with the Environmental Defense Fund and has also written a terrific new book, Will the Planet Notice, which I highly recommend to all of you, on sale on Amazon. I'll get my commission later. Cameron Hephurn, who's a senior research fellow at the Grantham Institute at the London School of Economics. And then we also have a surprise guest who's not in the printed program, but who I caught wandering the halls here and knew that we had to add him to our panel because he's such a respected figure in the climate field. Hal Harvey, who for many years directed the climate program at the Hewlett Foundation, was the founder and CEO of the ClimateWorks Foundation, is currently the CEO of the Energy Innovation Policy and Technology LLC. We have a terrific balance on the panel between economics, practical experience, and policy, so I'm sure we'll have a terrific debate. And the subject of this panel really builds off of the previous plenary panel this morning, and you can almost think of this as part two of that discussion for those who were there in the morning. The morning session raised issues around the deep connections between the physical system of the biosphere and the economy, and raised questions of safe operating spaces, limits, the sustainability of our growth paradigm, et cetera. I'm hoping that this panel is now going to take that a step further and really dig into some of those issues. And in my brief introduction, I get the easy job of asking the hard questions, and then these guys are going to have to answer them. So I'm just going to run through a little introduction, so if you want to sit down so we can all look at each other's slideshows, and then the panel will come back up for Q&A. And we're going to try and do something novel for an INET conference, which is actually leave enough time for some real discussion and debate. So we'll all try and move through our material relatively quickly. So I'm just going to frame things a little bit with a few facts and a few questions. I always think it's good to start with a little data and some facts just to sort of set the tone for things. And I'm going to talk about the challenge of decreasing carbon and increasing prosperity. And just to start, when you read economic history, the narrative of economic history makes it sound like there's some sort of march of progress narrative. And part of it is because most of the economic history we read about is about the richest and most powerful people and so on. But when you actually look at the economic history and work by Angus Madison, or in this case, Gregory Clark, what you see is that the world was a pretty poor place for most of its history. And as Clark points out in his book, the basic dynamics of, Malthus was kind of more or less roughly right for most of humanity's history. That that growth in wealth per capita was very constrained by population growth, really right up until the Industrial Revolution. And then we have this discontinuous period of change where about a third of the world's population, in essence, broke out of this Malthusian trap and experienced explosive growth in wealth per capita. And this is what Ricardo referred to in his session earlier as the Great Divergence. And then another roughly 2/3 of the world sort of has stayed in the Malthusian trap. And what we're experiencing today with the rise of China and India is about another third is making its escape. And this is, not a pattern of exponential growth. This is really a regime change and an explosive kind of growth. But we also know that that's had consequences for the planet. And this is an IPCC chart just showing changes in greenhouse gas concentrations over a fairly long period. And you see in this same spike pattern. And in a bit of PowerPoint trickery with no statistical meaning at all, I'm going to now fit the curve from Clark. You can see there's clearly a relationship here between the growth in per capita incomes and emissions data. So we've had this tight link between the two. So this then raises a key question as to, can we continue the growth that we've become accustomed to in the modern era and reduce emissions at the same time? This is what I frame as really the challenge of our century. And just to put a little bit of scaling on the problem, just to give an idea of how we might think about it, you can do a little simple arithmetic and just note, if you wanted to assume world GDP was going to grow at roughly the rate it has in the kind of modern age, around 3% per year, and if you at the same time want to reduce emissions down to 450 ppm territory, using the sort of IPCC numbers, you get a very simple relationship that something you can think of as carbon productivity, the ratio of GDP to carbon emissions. So it really is a productivity measure. It's how much GDP are you getting out of your carbon emissions? Would have to go from today about $740 of GDP per ton to $7,300. This is just the inverse of carbon intensity. It's nothing fancy about it. But as an economist, I like to think productivity measures are something we understand. So I invert it this way, and it just gives you a sense of the scale that this productivity of our carbon use has to increase 10 times is the basic answer between now and 2050. Now, just to personalize that a bit, if we capped emissions today and tried to live within kind of today's level of carbon productivity, what would your life be like? Well, U.S. per capita emissions, around 24 tons per person, and we've got that ranging all the way down to India at 1.9, and we know that to meet these emissions numbers, we have to get it down to about 1. You would have the following choice on your average day. You could either take a car ride, or you could have a bit of air conditioning, or you could buy a t-shirt, or you could eat a hamburger. And that would be it for the day. You're done. And you can't do more than one of those things. You could do one of those things and you'd be done. And you would have had your daily emissions allowance. So if we're going to have anything close to the lifestyle we enjoy today, and if the developing world is going to have anything close to this lifestyle, the economic wealth per unit of carbon has to go up by a dramatic amount. And again, just as an exercise of getting a rough idea of the scale of the challenge, if you look back in economic history and says, has any other productivity variable, had this kind of explosive growth at this magnitude? Well, labor productivity growth in the Industrial Revolution had a 10 times increase during the height of the Industrial Revolution, 1830 to 1955, and that's the solid line there. And what we see is that what we're asking to do to meet these emissions goals is that our carbon productivity increase has to reach that same level in about a third or even a quarter of the time. So just to put it quite plainly, we need an industrial revolution 3 times faster than the one we had that got us into this mess. That's the scale of transformation for the economy that we're talking about. And just to add further challenge, unlike the previous industrial revolution that happened in this kind of very organic, bottom-up fashion, we have to trigger this. We have to somehow artificially stimulate. We have to poke the economy in some way that kicks it in to this dramatic transformation at very high speed. So, and just to finally wrap up, we're not going at nearly that pace. This is just some data showing how carbon productivity has evolved over time. And the different lines are the paths different countries have taken. And what you see is, carbon productivity has improved. Largely it's really actually a function of energy efficiency improvement and technology improvement. And developed countries have seen, some modest increases. And some of the sort of best case examples, California, for example, has gone up a little bit faster than others, or Japan, which is considered a fairly green economy, has gone up a bit faster. But it's a bit hard to see, but this solid line here is the path we need to be on. And you can see how far we are here, up to here. And some countries are even going down. India, which is transforming from an agricultural economy, which actually very poor economies have pretty high carbon productivity because they don't emit much. But as India is industrializing, it's actually going through a dip in its carbon productivity before hopefully it starts to come back up. So here's the exam question for humanity. Using policy, can we artificially stimulate a new industrial revolution that creates a sustainable growth model for the world? Over to you guys.
I think Eric's just given a wonderful illustration of one of the reasons I like to be an academic, which is that I get to ask the questions, the exam questions, and not necessarily have to always answer them. But I will be a good boy and engage with the challenge here. Although I don't think I'm going to give you a proper exam question type answer to humanity's challenge. I'll say a little bit about material intensity and how that relates to the challenge that we've just heard about and how it relates to economic growth. This morning, we saw some charts which showed massive increases in the use of materials from around, certainly over the last 100 years, that are quite striking. And the implication that was kind of left hanging in the air is that we're going to run out of the stuff and that this is a problem. The interesting feature of material scarcity over the last 100 years is that if you take the classic economist way of thinking about scarcity, is the price going up? The answer is, well, no, it wasn't. For the 100 years from 1900, we actually had almost a halving of the price. And this is, because Eric was kind enough to invite me, I figured I should use some McKinsey Global Institute numbers here. But they're extremely interesting and very helpful numbers. So you can see the price of commodities as an index actually fell over the course of the 20th century, which is a pretty striking achievement given...
Is it pretty sensitive to the way you adjust for inflation?
Well, inflation is in there, not being the guy who created the index, but having one of the guys at least in the...
I've heard this disputed a lot based on the way you know.
I know it is inflation adjusted, but I couldn't possibly tell you if McKinsey have done the right job in their inflation adjustments. So. But I mean, I certainly think that let's have a good discussion afterwards. But the key point of this slide is actually the bit that's circled in red. It's kind of a way of indicating what I wanted you to look at, which is that over the last 10 years, this kind of commodity price index, irrespective of whether you take McKinsey's inflation adjusting as being accurate or not, has gone through the roof. And so the question this raises for us is this just one of these spikes that's going to go straight back down again? Or is this some kind of structural shift? And if it's a structural shift, what does it say about the exam question and about how difficult it is for us to increase carbon productivity by a factor of 10 or possibly several tens to get us onto a safe course for humanity? And the arguments in favour of it kind of potentially being a structural shift is that, you know, part of the cause of that increase is obviously the emergence of China and India and the new emerging middle class. There are about 1 billion middle class citizens in the world today. That's forecast to rise to 4 billion middle class consumers by 2050, with obviously massive pressure on resources, food, phosphorus, water, energy, etc. And obviously the material productivity of the economy as well as the carbon productivity are both going to have to expand massively if we're going to be able to satisfy those needs. And so the question that this makes me ask is, does this lead us to a world where we are aiming for green growth? So we clearly need to change the paradigm that we're in and change the structure of economic production and consumption. But does it lead us to a world with growth, or does it lead to a world without growth? And we heard this morning one of the proponents of the notion that actually we need to effectively stop the growth in the system. I'd like to challenge that idea. On this side here, we have the kind of classic ecological economics idea of the economy being embedded within an ecological subsystem, which I think is a very helpful way of thinking about the world we're in, solar energy coming in, heat going out, and the potential for recycle streams. Now, if you look at the world in this way, the economy clearly can't keep on growing forever. And that's one of the things that one is kind of tempted to conclude from the ecological economics limit. Now, we may stop growing in 10 years or 100 years or 1,000 years, but at some point, we're going to slow things down and stop. The point of this slide is really that if you think about what is the economy, even what is GDP, as flawed a measure of output as it is, let alone a measure of welfare, it's a measure of value, the value of things. And the process of economic production is really the combination of matter and energy and the application of human intelligence to rearranging combinations of matter and energy to deliver things that are of value to people. And I like to think that the key thing that is unbounded here is the application of human intelligence and the piece of the intellectual economy. So you can accept the ecological economist viewpoint that the material economy at some point is going to have to stop growing and say, but if we can keep combining matter and energy with increasing amounts of human intelligence, then we can keep delivering increases in value. To give you one little example, if you go to a play, some Shakespeare, and maybe it's an amateur dramatic production, it's not particularly enlightening, you don't have a good time, it's poorly acted, you've paid £5 and you've left. That's great. Or you could go to the same play by Shakespeare, performed magnificently well, touches your life, makes you view humanity in a completely different way. You pay £50, maybe your willingness to pay might have been many multiples of £50, but either way, you've just added £50 to your GDP versus adding 5. That's a tenfold increase in GDP from those two activities, but they both contain the same basic material substrate. We've had more human intellect put forward to the play that you pay £50 for. Okay. There's a long paper on the website. Eric's given us a very strict time limit, so I'm not going to take you through much of it other than to say that in the paper what we do is extend classical Cobb-Douglas type production functions. We add in materials to the equation. We allow technology to differ. We look across 480 odd sectors of the US economy over 50 years. We calculate production functions for different subsectors, and then we have a look at how the factor intensity of materials versus labour versus capital is related to the productivity of those sectors. And the short story is that using some fancy econometrics, which I'm certainly not ideally placed to explain, I have co-authors, it's very wise, the basic result is that reducing the material intensity of production, so substituting away from materials and substituting in for labour, or for manufactured capital, which is effectively the embodiment of human intelligence within some kind of material structure, doesn't necessarily reduce your productivity. In fact, the evidence suggests that it increases your productivity, and there is a negative correlation between material intensity and sector productivity. Now, there are various reasons why you might find that type of relationship, some of them kind of more interesting than others. One of them might be that it's some kind of artifact of sectoral aggregation. So as per the conversation we were having in the complexity discussion earlier, we had a look at another level, had a look at the firm level and used a Korean database and found that if you just look across firms, you also find this result. So even within the one sector, the firms that are more material intense in their inputs have lower total factor productivity. Interestingly, there's no relationship with capital intensity of production, but if you use more people, you tend to have a higher total factor productivity. So why? Well, three possible reasons for this association, and it may not be causal. The first is that if you use more people, people tend to kind of, they're not like rocks or matter. They think, they improve themselves, they have ideas, they move around between firms, and there are spillovers that are not necessarily captured when you just use a raw measure of labour, which for better or worse is what we've got here. It's not a human capital adjusted or education adjusted measure of labour. So it may be that more labour in your sector and your firm leads to some kind of spillovers. That's not an entirely satisfactory explanation, but does suggest a policy implication, which is, even if that's true, shifting away from materials and towards more human intensity in your production may indeed increase productivity. Another explanation is that firms that focus on reducing their material intensity may kind of fantastically discover other ways of increasing their productivity. So there is also a causal relationship between reductions in material intensity and increases in productivity. And finally, perhaps well-managed firms simply do both well, and there's no causal relationship at all. So under the first two explanations there, we do have some kind of causal connection. So what would you do? And this is, these policy ideas are more suggested rather than necessarily inferred from what's come before. If material intensity is negatively associated with total factor productivity, then we could start by looking at the vast amounts of money we spend on subsidizing the consumption of materials around the world at the moment and resources. It's about $1 trillion spent on direct resource consumption, $1 trillion spent indirectly through the mispricing of greenhouse gas emissions, possibly $6 trillion, these are per annum figures, on mispricing of all of the natural capital that we have. So that's one obvious thing to do, especially when we're resource constrained. Shift the tax base. We tax the productive thing, labour, and we don't tax materials. And finally, as Jeff here was saying this morning, we're in this unusual situation where we dig up an asset and we sell it, and we treat the sale of the asset as income, when it really isn't income, it's the sale of an asset. And there are various challenges that we have in the national accounting system that are more subtle than that particular one, where material intensity sectors effectively get overstated in the national accounts. So dealing with the sorts of insights from this paper and adjusting national accounts may help to improve policy. So that's it, at least for the moment. I don't think I've really answered the exam question, but I suppose I've pointed hopefully in some of the directions that we need to go in order to improve our carbon and material productivity and make sure that we don't all wipe ourselves out. Thanks.